The battle cries of men echoed across the vast Mongolian steppes, the ground beneath them trembling with the thunderous hooves of war horses. Arrows flew through the air with deadly precision, cutting through the cold morning mist as the Mongol army, led by a man whose name would one day be known across the world, surged forward. At the forefront of the charge, Genghis Khan, then known only as Temujin, stood, his face a mask of focus, his eyes locked on the horizon, where the enemy forces gathered. Behind him, thousands of riders followed, their swift, unrelenting advance pushing the enemy into retreat. It was not just another battle. It was the beginning of the rise of an empire that would stretch across continents. As the enemy lines broke, Temujin's mind raced not just with the thrill of victory, but with the knowledge that his world was changing. The blood spilled on these fields. The alliances forged in the heat of battle would pave the way for his destiny. From the harsh wilderness of Mongolia, where he had been abandoned to die as a child, Temujin had risen, an outcast turned conqueror, a leader whose vision would unite the scattered tribes and change the course of history forever. But this was only the beginning. Hey there, I'm glad you're here. In today's video, I will take you through the timeline of the story of Genghis Khan, a boy born into hardship who would rise to become one of history's most legendary conquerors. We'll start with his early struggles, from the death of his father to his rise from outcast to powerful leader. We'll then follow his unification of the Mongol tribes, his strategic genius in battle, and the vast empire he built across Asia and Europe. Finally, we'll explore the lasting legacy of his reign and how it reshaped the world. Comment below and let us know where you're watching from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit that button. And if you choose not to, we'd love to know why in the comment section. Your feedback helps us improve. The Mongolian plateau, vast and untamed, stretched endlessly beneath a sky often as indifferent as the land itself. The landscape, unforgiving in its extremes, formed the very essence of the Mongol people, wild, harsh, and untamable. Here, survival was never a guarantee. In the coldest winters, the temperature could plunge to over 40 degrees below zero, while in the summer, droughts would ravage entire herds of livestock, the lifeblood of the Mongol tribes. With each shift in season, the land demanded a toll, and those who survived learned to adapt, fight, and endure. The Mongols, living on the fringes of the known world, were both shaped and constrained by this unforgiving environment. The constant cycles of raids and battles between rival tribes were not born from some primordial lust for conquest, but were a natural outgrowth of the need to control territory and resources. The steppes, wide and open, offered no natural barriers. The wind carried not just the dust of the earth, but also the whisper of battle. This land, though rich with the promise of wide horizons, was also littered with the corpses of those who failed to heed its challenges. It was into this brutal environment that Temujin was born. At first glance, his beginnings were nothing more than a footnote in a world defined by constant struggle. Born in 1162 to Yesugai, a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, Temujin's future appeared uncertain, even grim. The Mongol world was fragmented, a collection of fiercely independent tribes locked in a cycle of alliances and betrayals, of ever-shifting borders where loyalty was fluid and power came only through force. In such a world, the idea of greatness was foreign to most. How could a boy, born in a small, inconsequential clan, rise to command the allegiance of tribes, let alone forge an empire? Yet, this was the world in which Temujin was destined to make his mark. To many, his early life seemed destined to be one of hardship and obscurity, much like the dozens of other tribal chiefs who rose and fell with the seasons. For much of his youth, survival was the only goal, and in those years, his life was a testament to the harshness of the world he inhabited. At the age of 9, Temujin's father was poisoned by rivals from the Tatar tribe, leaving the boy and his family vulnerable to those who had once been allies. Stripped of all protection, they were forced to live like outcasts on the margins of society, surviving on roots and small game. In these early years, the young Temujin learned lessons that would later shape his approach to leadership. He learned to endure. He learned that trust was a luxury few could afford. He learned that in a world where betrayal was as common as the wind, a man's word meant little unless backed by strength. This was not the world of kings and castles. This was the world of warriors and nomads, where power was measured not by birthright, but by one's ability to command loyalty and strike fear into the hearts of rivals. Yet, even in the shadow of hardship, there were glimmers of what was to come. As Temujin grew, his mother, Hoelun, instilled in him a philosophy that would define his life and legacy. Unity is strength, she would tell him. Together, you can withstand any enemy, but a single arrow is easily broken. This lesson would later shape not just his family, but also his empire. In the harsh, tribal environment of the steppes, the idea of unity was not just a strategy, it was survival. Alone, a man was vulnerable, weak, but together, there was strength to overcome even the most insurmountable odds. Despite the cruelty of his early years, Temujin's ambition began to take root. He was not yet a leader. His family had no power, no resources, but he had something far more important, a vision. In his heart, a seed had been planted that would grow into a powerful drive to unify the Mongol tribes, to break the cycle of betrayal, and to forge something greater than mere survival. Temujin's humble beginnings could easily have been the end of his story, but in the vast, empty expanse of the Mongolian plateau, where survival was as uncertain as the wind, he learned to make his own fate. The very land that had abandoned him would, in time, become the ground upon which he would build his empire. The world that birthed Temujin was unforgiving, and yet it was within these very trials that his destiny was shaped. The Mongol steppes, where life and death were dictated by the whims of the land and the ruthlessness of its people, would be the proving ground for the greatest leader the world had ever known. Greatness, once so far beyond his reach, would become his fate, not as a gift, but as the result of a struggle against forces greater than himself. It was in the quiet moments of his youth, amid the brutality of the land, that the first whispers of Genghis Khan began to stir. Though the world would never have predicted it, there was something in Temujin that set him apart from the rest. His ambition, born from suffering and hardship, would soon give way to a fierce determination to forge an empire that would span continents and change the course of history. In 1162, amidst the sweeping, barren lands of the Mongolian steppes, a child was born to a clan at the very heart of the region's constant turmoil. The Borjigin clan, though far from the most powerful in the Mongol world, was one of many that carved their existence from the unforgiving land. Temujin, as the child would come to be known, entered the world as part of a tribe fractured by internal rivalries, where leadership was constantly tested by bloodshed, betrayal, and fleeting alliances. These were not the grand palaces or fortified cities of the West, but the ever-changing horizons of the steppe, a place where survival was not guaranteed and where every clan leader had to earn their position through victories and alliances, never by the mere accident of birth. At the core of the Mongol world was a loose collection of tribes, each with their own chieftains, who fought for control over the land, the water, and the herds. But leadership among the Mongols was not a static position. It was a fluid, ever-changing mantle. Unlike the hereditary monarchies of Europe, Mongol leaders could rise through merit, through battle, and sometimes by simply being the last standing after a bloody contest for power. A Kurultai, or council, was often summoned to decide on matters of leadership, but these meetings were more a formality than anything resembling democratic elections. A leader might be chosen, but only if they had the power to command loyalty and respect, often through a combination of force, cunning, and diplomacy. The Borjigin clan, though respected, was constantly caught in the currents of Mongol tribal politics, where alliances were forged and shattered like fragile glass. Yesugai, Temujin's father, was a man of some standing, though not one of absolute dominance. As a member of the Borjigin, he had the bloodline to make his claim to leadership legitimate, but his power was often at the mercy of his rivals. Yesugai, much like the men around him, needed not just courage, but savvy political maneuvering to maintain his position. His leadership was not absolute, and his ability to retain control rested on keeping key allies satisfied, playing one rival against another, and keeping his enemies at bay through calculated diplomacy. Yet, this very web of political webs he wove would later prove his undoing. In 1171, after an alliance with a rival tribe broke down, Yesugai was poisoned by the Tatar, his body left to rot as a symbol of the fragile and often violent nature of Mongol politics. The Borjigin clan's standing was shattered. This event, Yesugai's death, was the moment the world began to shift for young Temujin. At just 9 years old, he found himself not in the care of powerful relatives or supported by the tribal council, but abandoned by those who had once pledged loyalty to his family. Temujin's early life was one of hardship, defined not by wealth or privilege, but by the necessity to survive through sheer will. As a child of noble blood, Temujin had been afforded little in the way of personal power. The tribal politics of the Mongols were such that birthright alone would not sustain him. His family was left to roam the steppes in search of safety, often at the mercy of those who had once considered themselves allies. The Borjigin clan's fate after Yesugai's death was a reflection of the precarious nature of power in the Mongol world. The very structure of Mongol society was such that alliances were fragile. Tribes were bound together only as long as it was convenient, and the moment one party faltered, the others would pounce. Yesugai's death left a void not only in his family's leadership, but in the larger political landscape of the Mongols. The power vacuum created by his demise triggered an immediate unraveling. The political landscape was defined by betrayal, as each tribe, including the Borjigin, faced a new set of challenges and opportunities in their struggle for control over the land. In the wake of his father's death, Temujin was forced to confront a stark reality. The world did not care for the fate of a boy from an abandoned family. Loyalty and alliances, once ideals in his family's political approach, were revealed to be fragile. Temujin was not merely a child of a fallen chieftain. He was now part of the landscape of survival, where one's wits, strength, and ability to form new alliances were the true currency of power. It was here, amid the broken promises of his father's allies, that Temujin began to forge his own path, one built not on the inherited advantages of his father's tribe, but on his ability to reclaim lost ground and gather a following of his own. Yesugai's influence on Temujin was profound, not just because of the inheritance of leadership, but in the lessons taught through failure. Yesugai's struggle, his attempt to maintain control through alliances and personal strength, was an example of how even the most capable leaders could be undone by betrayal and the shifting tides of political power. In contrast, Temujin would come to understand that his future would not be shaped by external loyalty or weak alliances. He would form his own alliances, break his own enemies, and build a dynasty that was not dependent on blood, but on loyalty, merit, and sheer determination. The Borjigin clan's collapse served as a crucible for the young Temujin, where his father had played the political game and relied on the shifting sands of Mongol alliances. Temujin would build his power on a more solid foundation, one where he would not just rely on his blood, but earn his place through strength, leadership, and vision. In the unforgiving landscape of the Mongolian steppes, where the horizon stretched endlessly under a sealed indifferent sky, survival was never guaranteed. It was here, in 1162, that Temujin was born into the Borjigin clan, an ancient lineage whose future, like many of the tribes around them, was uncertain. The Mongol world at that time was a mosaic of fragmented tribes, constantly at war, forever shifting alliances. The lore of the steppes was not written in scrolls, but in the blood of warriors, in the decisions of those who held the reins of power. Here, nothing was guaranteed, and everything had a price: loyalty, land, and even life itself. But in the harshest of environments, one woman stood as a beacon of strength and wisdom: Hoelun, Temujin's mother. Though often overlooked in the grand narratives of history, Hoelun's role in her son's rise was profound. Born into the Oirat tribe, Hoelun was no stranger to the realities of power and survival. She understood better than anyone that in a world where trust was fragile and alliances were as fleeting as the winds, survival wasn't just about strength. It was about the ability to adapt, unite, and lead in times of trial. When Yesugai, Temujin's father, was poisoned in 1171 by the Tatar clan, leaving the family vulnerable, Hoelun's wisdom became their guiding star. She was not just a mother, she was the leader of her people, in a world that knew only the language of warriors. In a moment that could have shattered the spirit of any lesser family, Hoelun showed Temujin how to endure, not just physically, but spiritually. From an early age, Temujin was taught that survival was the cornerstone of everything. Hoelun's lessons were blunt but clear. There was no room for weakness, no space for hesitation. In the wilds, Temujin, you must be quick to learn or quick to die, she would often say. These lessons were harsh but necessary. In the desolate expanses of the Mongol steppes, where food was scarce and enemies even scarcer, each day was a struggle for life. Yet, survival was not only about the strength of the body, but about the strength of the mind. Hoelun taught her son that survival required not just endurance, but adaptability, a quality that would define Temujin's future as a leader. As Temujin grew older, the teachings of unity and loyalty became the bedrock of his personal philosophy. In a world where the loyalty of allies could shift like the wind, Hoelun's lessons on trust were not idealistic. They were born from the reality of Mongol life. Your brothers are your strength, she would say. Never forget the bond of blood. But know, too, that strength can be found in others who share your vision. It was through this belief in unity that Temujin began to understand the importance of loyalty, not as something granted, but as something earned. But Hoelun's wisdom wasn't confined to lessons of survival and loyalty alone. She saw the world not just through the lens of personal survival, but of strategic survival. She knew the way the Mongol tribes operated, constantly shifting between conflict and alliance, where survival depended on one's ability to manipulate those allegiances, even when they seemed ephemeral. Hoelun taught her son to observe, to listen, and to understand the motivations of others. She showed him how to read the subtle signs of power, the way leaders interacted with their followers, and how alliances could be forged not just through force, but through shared interests and mutual respect. It was through her wisdom that Temujin began to see the fragility of power and the necessity of solidifying it. In the years after Yesugai's death, as Temujin's family struggled to survive, it was Hoelun who held them together. She led her children with unyielding determination, instilling in them a sense of purpose and survival. Yet, there was always the understanding that survival was not the end. It was simply the beginning. Hoelun's teachings were never about mere existence. They were about becoming something greater. Survival is the first step, she would tell him. But power, true power, is built by uniting the broken, by gathering those who would otherwise fall apart. These lessons would stay with Temujin, shaping him as he ventured out into the world. The first alliances he would form would not be based on simple convenience or blood alone. They would be grounded in trust and unity, the very principles that Hoelun had instilled in him during his formative years. The relationship between mother and son was not merely one of love, but of shared purpose. Hoelun's quiet influence would echo in Temujin's mind as he grew into Genghis Khan, a leader who would unite not just the Mongol tribes, but vast swaths of the known world. As Temujin rose through the ranks, these teachings would be tested. In 1206, when the Kurultai declared him Genghis Khan, it wasn't just his strength in battle that earned him the title. It was his ability to unite a fragmented people, to turn rival tribes into one unstoppable force. Hoelun's wisdom, her teachings on unity, survival, and loyalty would become the cornerstone of his empire. It was through this unity that he would build a force that would conquer the world. Hoelun, though often forgotten in the grand historical narrative, was, in essence, the architect of Genghis Khan's success. Her wisdom and vision were woven into the very fabric of his leadership. The lessons she imparted were not just about surviving the Mongol steppes, but about surviving the world itself, about uniting others to face the forces that sought to divide and conquer. As Temujin's empire grew, it was clear that the foundation of his power was built on more than just military genius. It was built on the spiritual and moral teachings of his mother, a woman who, in the most challenging circumstances, taught him that true strength came not from the sword alone, but from the bonds of loyalty, unity, and shared purpose. The year was 1171, and in the heart of the Mongolian steppes, winter's chill was beginning to take hold. The wind, harsh and unforgiving, swept across the endless grasslands, carrying with it whispers of shifting alliances and the ever-present tension that defined the Mongol tribes. The Borjigin clan, once a respected force in the region, had its future intertwined with the leadership of Yesugai, a capable and cunning chieftain who had forged strategic alliances to safeguard his family's place among the Mongol elites. But the winds of fate, like the icy gusts that cut through the plains, can shift without warning. Yesugai, leader of the Borjigin, was a man who understood the fragile nature of power. His alliances, while strong, were constantly tested by the ever-present threats of rival clans and the political volatility of the Mongol steppes. His life, though marked by a series of successes in battle and politics, was also defined by precariousness, a constant struggle to maintain his position in a world where strength could fade in an instant. It was in 1171, far from the security of his home, that Yesugai's fate was sealed. As he rode to meet with the Tatar tribe, ostensibly to negotiate, the poison entered his veins, silently, unnoticed. The Tatar, a rival clan, had long plotted against him. The drink that was offered to Yesugai was no simple gesture of hospitality. It was the harbinger of death. Yesugai collapsed swiftly, his life slipping away in the cold air, the end of a long and hard-fought journey. The news of Yesugai's death arrived like a thunderclap, echoing across the plains to his family. The moment Hoylun, Temujin's mother, received the word, a heavy silence fell over their camp. She had borne witness to her husband's struggles and triumphs, standing by him as he navigated the treacherous politics of the steppes. Yet this blow was one from which the family could not recover easily. For Hoylun, it was not just the loss of a husband, it was the loss of the foundation of their world. Temujin, still just a boy of 9, could not fathom the depth of the political catastrophe that had just befallen them, but he understood the immediate loss. The absence of his father was more than just a personal blow. It was the loss of the protector, the provider, the very symbol of their security. Hoylun, however, was no stranger to hardship. Though her grief was profound, it was tempered by a hard-won wisdom. She knew the harshness of the world better than most. The world of the Mongol tribes, though defined by loyalty, was equally defined by its instability. A leader's death was never just a personal tragedy, it was a political event. And in the aftermath of Yesugai's death, the Borjigin clan was left vulnerable. Temujin, now thrust into a world that seemed to have no place for him, saw his family abandoned by the very tribe that had once sworn allegiance to his father. The shock was not just the loss of Yesugai, it was the abandonment that followed. According to Mongol custom, the family of the deceased chief was often left to fend for themselves. This was not out of malice, but rather the harsh political realities of the time. The death of a leader created a vacuum of power, and in that vacuum, the tribe's allegiance could shift. As soon as Yesugai was gone, his family was no longer a symbol of power, but a reminder of weakness. A reminder that the Borjigin clan no longer had a strong hand at the table. The Mongol tribes were fluid in their allegiances, and loyalty was often a matter of survival rather than duty. Those who had once been Yesugai's allies were now faced with the question of which side would offer them more power. Abandonment was the price for their failure to secure the succession. Temujin, now the head of a fractured family, would learn the most brutal lesson of all. Power was never guaranteed, and the only certainty in the Mongol world was that everything could change with the death of a leader. He and his mother were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered world. Without the protection of the Borjigin clan's strength, they were forced to live like outcasts, dependent not on the promises of others, but on their own wits and ability to survive. In this moment, Temujin's understanding of loyalty and power was forever altered. His father had been a powerful leader, but he had not been able to escape the fragile nature of Mongol politics. Now, Temujin, though young, could see clearly that in this world, a man's future was not decided by his birthright or the strength of his ancestors. It was decided by his ability to adapt, to forge alliances, and to wield power not through traditional means, but through sheer force of will. This moment, the death of his father, followed by the abandonment of his family, would serve as the crucible in which Temujin's future would be forged. His path would not be one of inherited privilege or easy victories. It would be a path marked by hardship, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of power that would eventually lead him to unite the Mongol tribes. But first, he would need to learn that loyalty in the Mongol world was something you had to earn, not expect. The year was 1171, and the Mongolian steppes lay stretched before the Borjigin clan, an unforgiving expanse of cold, barren grasslands. The earth beneath their feet had been home to many generations of warriors, but for young Temujin, it was the canvas of his earliest memories. Memories now tainted by the sudden death of his father, Yesugai. It was not just a loss of life, it was the disintegration of the world he had known. Yesugai's death, brought about by the covert actions of the Tatar tribe, shook the foundations of the Borjigin clan. Yesugai had been more than just a father. He was the clan's protector, its strength in a world of perpetual warfare. The suddenness of his death left the family vulnerable, a fractured unit, in a landscape that demanded unity and strength. As the news of Yesugai's poisoning spread, like wildfire across the steppes, Temujin's family faced a harsh new reality. The alliances that had once protected them collapsed as quickly as they had been made. The cold winds of the Mongolian plateau seemed to carry with them not only the scent of winter, but the promise of betrayal and loss. For Hoelun, the mother of Temujin, the death of her husband was not just a personal tragedy, it was a political upheaval. She had borne witness to the fragility of Mongol leadership, having been raised among the Oirat tribes, and now she faced the brutal truth of Mongol customs. When a chief dies, his family is abandoned. Power in this world was never guaranteed. It was temporary, dependent on strength and the ability to protect alliances. With Yesugai's death, the Borjigin clan no longer had a protector. The loyalty of their allies, once a pillar of their strength, now meant nothing. Hoelun, once the wife of a powerful chief, now found herself at the mercy of the very tribal customs that had once ensured their survival. Temujin, still a young boy, witnessed the abandonment of his family with a sharp clarity that would shape his understanding of the world. The Mongol custom of abandoning a chief's family after his death was harsh and unyielding. Temujin's family, left to fend for themselves in the wilderness, faced an almost insurmountable struggle. For a boy born to a chieftain, it was a fate that carried the sting of betrayal by those who had once sworn fealty to his father, and by the very tribesmen who had once shared in his father's strength. The Borjigin clan's influence was no more. Now, they were just another family in the endless struggle for survival among the Mongol tribes. The landscape was as unforgiving as the world they now inhabited. Winters on the steppes could see the temperature plummet to 40 degrees below zero, and the scorching summer months left the rivers dry and the earth parched. Temujin's family became wanderers, living off whatever they could find. Small game, whatever berries and roots could be scavenged. The Mongolian steppes, with its vast horizons and brutal conditions, became both a classroom and a battleground for Temujin, who learned early on that survival was never guaranteed. It was a lesson not just in endurance, but in resilience, in the ability to adapt to every changing circumstance, every cruel setback. Despite the harshness of his early years, Temujin's spirit remained unbroken. He learned not only to survive, but to survive in a world that demanded more than just basic existence. The young boy, thrust into this bleak world, came to realize that in the Mongol world, leadership was not just a gift. It was something that had to be earned. His mind, still tender with youth, began to understand that power was not something inherited, not something you could simply claim by blood. Power was something you had to fight for, and Temujin was beginning to see that, to survive in this world, he would have to earn his place, not through lineage or alliances, but through his own determination. It was in 1177, when Temujin was around 15 years old, that his first encounter with true betrayal occurred. A betrayal that would not just shape his future, but serve as a brutal lesson in the harsh realities of Mongol politics. His half-brother, Bektar, a boy from a different mother, had long been a close companion, someone who had helped Temujin and his family survive the early days after his father's death. Yet, as the years passed, rivalries began to emerge among the children of Hoelun, each of them vying for position, for power, in a world where leadership was never guaranteed. The tension between Temujin and Bektar had been growing for some time. Bektar, increasingly resentful of the influence Temujin had begun to wield, began to see him not as a brother, but as a rival for the future leadership of the family. In the world of the Mongol tribes, this rivalry could only end in violence. One fateful day, as the family ventured out on a hunting trip, Bektar confronted Temujin. What began as a heated argument quickly escalated into a violent conflict, one that ended with Bektar's death. Whether it was a deliberate act of betrayal or a consequence of heated tempers is lost to history, but the effect on Temujin was profound. The murder of his half-brother was not just a personal tragedy, it was an early lesson in the brutal nature of Mongol society. In this world, betrayal was not an exception, it was an inevitability. Power was not given freely, and loyalty was something that had to be constantly earned and guarded. The fact that Bektar, once an ally, could so quickly become an enemy was a revelation for Temujin. This early betrayal marked the beginning of his understanding of how loyalty could be a fragile, easily broken thing. In the aftermath, Temujin began to develop his understanding of leadership. He saw how even the closest bonds could be shattered in a heartbeat, and how loyalty, once broken, could not be easily repaired. Temujin knew that to build his power, he would have to not only earn loyalty, but command it in a way that made betrayal unthinkable. He would come to understand that leadership was not about inheritance. It was about securing the allegiance of those around you through strength, vision, and the ability to inspire fear and respect. The year was 1172, and the Mongolian steppes stretched endlessly before Temujin, their vastness reflecting the isolation his family now faced. The Borjigin clan, once respected, now shattered, had been reduced to nothing more than a fragmented group of outcasts, struggling to survive in a world that was as harsh as it was unforgiving. Yesugai, Temujin's father, had been the glue that held their world together. But with his death at the hands of the Tatar, Temujin and his family found themselves abandoned by the very people who had once sworn loyalty to them. In the aftermath of Yesugai's death, the Borjigin clan's fall from power was swift and brutal. The world around them seemed to collapse. Once thriving alliances disintegrated, and their enemies, sensing weakness, closed in. The family's survival became a daily struggle, a relentless fight against both the elements and the harsh social order that favored the strong. Hoylun, Temujin's mother, was a woman of remarkable resilience. She had witnessed the rise and fall of leaders within her own Oirat tribe, and now, having lost her husband and the protection of the Borjigin clan, she became the linchpin of her children's survival. The lessons Hoylun passed on were not those of comfort, but of hardship and resourcefulness. She taught Temujin that survival was a matter of understanding nature, reading the land, knowing when to move, when to strike, and when to retreat. The Mongolian steppes offered no mercy. The winter's chill would freeze a man's breath before he could speak, and the summer heat would dry up the rivers, leaving the land barren and unforgiving. Temujin, though still a boy, quickly adapted to these conditions. His physical endurance became his first teacher. He learned to move like the wind, silent and unnoticed, tracking game across the grasslands. His skills with the bow sharpened, and his hands, once soft from years of royal comfort, grew calloused from the labor of survival. But it wasn't just his physicality that grew, it was his understanding of leadership. Hoylun showed him that survival required more than just brute force. It required adaptability, wisdom, and the abilities to inspire loyalty in those who followed you. Temujin was beginning to learn that in the world he now inhabited, nothing could be taken for granted. Not alliances, not trust, and certainly not power. He was becoming a nomad, not by choice but by necessity, forced to rely on his instincts as much as his mother's wisdom. As Temujin's survival skills grew, so did his leadership potential. In this period, he would often accompany his mother to the camps of other Mongol tribes, hoping for aid. It was here that Temujin learned to read people. He began to understand that alliances were not just made through blood or kinship. They were built on mutual benefit, on trust, and on shared survival. The young boy who had once been destined to inherit a powerful clan now had to learn that power was not given, it was earned. The lessons Temujin learned in these years, under the watchful eye of his mother, would serve as the foundation for the future empire he would build. The Mongol world had hardened him, but Holun's wisdom had tempered that hardness with the understanding of what true strength was. Not just the ability to conquer, but the ability to unite and lead through the hardest of times. As Temujin entered his late teens, he began to recognize that the survival of his family and the future of his ambitions would hinge not just on physical strength, but on strategic alliances. In 1178, when he was around 16 years old, Temujin's marriage to Berta, a young woman from the Khwarezmian Mongol tribe, marked the first calculated step in his larger political strategy. This union, though born out of necessity rather than love, would be the foundation of Temujin's first serious political alliances. The Khwarezmian Mongol tribe, a significant power on the steppes, had its own history of warfare and alliances, and through his marriage to Berta, Temujin sought to strengthen his position in a world where loyalty was fragile and betrayal could come at any moment. By marrying Berta, Temujin secured an alliance with the Khwarezmian Mongol tribe, whose influence would bolster his standing among the Mongol clans. This marriage, though seemingly a personal union, was in reality a political calculation, a way for Temujin to expand his reach and strengthen his claim to leadership. But Temujin was not just marrying for political gain. He was also building relationships with the powerful families of the steppes. This was a subtle yet crucial element of Mongol tribal life. Relationships were often forged not just in battle, but through alliances and pacts that ensured survival and influence. Temujin's marriage to Berta was the first in a series of political moves that would define his later conquests and empire-building strategies. What made this union significant was the way it symbolized Temujin's understanding of power. Unlike the previous generation of Mongol leaders who relied on military prowess to maintain control, Temujin was already starting to understand the value of diplomacy and strategic alliances. Marriage was one of the most powerful tools a leader could use to solidify loyalty and create a network of support across the steppes. Temujin's ability to forge alliances through marriage would serve as a template for his future conquests. As the years passed, Temujin's strategic acumen would only grow sharper. His union with Berta was not a momentary decision, but part of a larger vision, one that saw the Mongol tribes not as fragmented factions, but as a potential united force under his leadership. The groundwork for his empire was laid during these formative years, and his marriage to Berta was the first sign of his political ingenuity. The year was 1182, a moment that marked a pivotal shift in the Mongol steppes, a world of constant warfare, tribal allegiances, and a harsh, unforgiving landscape. Temujin, still young, had already tasted the bitterness of betrayal, and the echoes of his father's death still reverberated through the Borjigin clan. But nothing prepared him for the personal affront of the Merkit tribe's abduction of his wife, Berta. The kidnapping was not just an insult, it was a direct challenge to Temujin's very identity and growing authority. In a world where honor was everything, and the blood feud was a tool for survival, there was no option but to respond with force. Temujin, now in his early 20s, was more than just a boy who had lost his father. He was a man who had already begun to understand the fragility of power, the volatility of alliances, and the importance of loyalty. The Merkits' actions were a challenge to the very fabric of the Mongol way of life, where family was everything. The abduction wasn't just personal, it was political. It was a sign of weakness, an insult that had to be avenged for Temujin to hold any future claim to leadership. With a fierce determination, Temujin organized his first military campaign against the Merkit, setting into motion a plan that would reveal his growing tactical genius. Rather than simply relying on brute force, Temujin's strategy was grounded in the speed and mobility of the Mongol warriors. Temujin was already beginning to understand that the Mongol tribes could not fight like the settled peoples of the West, nor could they rely on outdated methods of traditional combat. He understood that to succeed, he would need to outmaneuver his enemies, not just overpower them. Temujin's forces were relatively small, but highly mobile. He relied on surprise and the element of speed. Strike hard, and then retreat before the enemy had time to react. The Mongol warriors, used to the grueling demands of life on the steppe, were well trained in hit-and-run tactics, and Temujin knew how to exploit their strengths. In a series of raids, Temujin's forces ambushed the Merkit, using the terrain of the steppes to their advantage. The Merkit tribe, though formidable, could not match the mobility and precision of Temujin's forces. The Merkits' defeat wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a statement. It was a demonstration of Temujin's ruthlessness, his ability to unite disparate factions, and his emerging understanding of strategy. This victory was not just about the rescue of Berta, it was about Temujin's political ascension. The success of the campaign solidified his reputation as a man capable of leading, of winning, not just through brute force, but with strategy, vision, and the ability to unite men under a single cause. His forces returned with Berta, but more importantly, Temujin had proven that his leadership was rooted not just in revenge, but in a broader vision of the Mongol future. Temujin's first military campaign would define much of his later strategy. Surprise, speed, and mobility became the hallmark of his tactics, but his emerging leadership style, one based on loyalty and merit rather than bloodline, was already becoming evident. This was the beginning of something much larger, a rise that would eventually see him unite the Mongol tribes under his banner, not through inherited authority, but through ability and vision. In the wake of his victory over the Merkit, Temujin's mind began to turn toward the greater challenge that lay ahead. He understood, perhaps more deeply than any leader before him, that the Mongol tribes were broken, fragmented, and ruled by tradition. But the traditions of tribal warfare, based on bloodlines and inherited power, had only led to perpetual infighting and brittleness. Temujin's early experiences, his father's betrayal, his family's abandonment, and his own struggle for survival, had taught him one central truth. Loyalty could not be assumed. It had to be earned. Temujin's break with Mongol traditions wasn't just a personal decision. It was a revolutionary shift in how the Mongol world would operate. He rejected the idea that leadership should be determined by birthright and bloodline. Instead, he would create a system based on merit, where a man's ability and loyalty were the only criteria for rising to power. This was a direct challenge to the tribal norms that had governed Mongol society for centuries. At the heart of this revolution was Temujin's army. Unlike the traditional Mongol military, which was based on tribal divisions, Temujin's forces were composed of individuals chosen for their abilities, not their ancestry. Whether they were former enemies, outcasts, or men from other tribes, Temujin valued loyalty and skill over family connections. This was a radical departure from the norm, and it forever changed the structure of Mongol society. The tribal chiefs, once the noble leaders of their clans, now found themselves competing with each other, not just for territory, but for the loyalty of their men. Temujin's decision to reward merit rather than lineage also extended beyond the military. His political strategies reflected this shift, as he integrated men from all walks of life into his inner circle. Temujin's closest generals, men like Jebe and Kublai, were not necessarily from the most powerful families, but they had proven themselves in battle, earning their place in Temujin's ranks. This meritocracy laid the foundation for the Mongol Empire's rise. As his empire grew, Temujin's leadership became increasingly centered around the principle that loyalty and merit, not bloodline, determined the strength of the Mongol world. Temujin's break with tradition was more than just a tactical move. It was an ideological revolution that would create a new Mongol identity. This revolutionary approach to leadership transformed the Mongol military, making it one of the most efficient, disciplined, and ruthless forces the world had ever seen. It marked the beginning of a new era, one in which the Mongol Empire would be built not on the strength of any one tribe, but on the ability of its leaders and warriors. By 1186, the once unbreakable bond between Temujin and Jamuka had begun to fracture. They had been blood brothers, bound by the ancient Mongol custom of Anda, an oath that symbolized mutual loyalty and trust. Yet, beneath the surface of their partnership, an ideological rift had been growing for years. Jamuka, the aristocrat, deeply rooted in the traditions of Mongol leadership, valued the noble birth as the key to authority. Temujin, however, driven by a vision for the future, believed in a new system, one based on merit, loyalty, and the ability to lead rather than the bloodline from which one came. At first, their differences were subtle, born of their varying upbringings. Temujin, the son of a fallen chieftain, understood the precariousness of power and the need to earn respect through deeds rather than birthright. Jamuka, on the other hand, had been raised in the heart of the Mongol aristocracy, where noble status was everything. As their alliance grew, their differing views on leadership began to clash, particularly after Temujin's successful campaigns and his growing influence over the Mongol tribes. The Merkit campaign in 1182 had been a significant turning point. Temujin's military success demonstrated his growing prowess, both as a warrior and as a leader. It wasn't just a personal triumph, but a moment that shifted the power dynamics among the Mongol tribes. Jamuka, increasingly jealous and threatened, began to resent Temujin's growing influence. For Jamuka, the old ways were sacred. The noble bloodline had to be preserved, and power should remain in the hands of those born into leadership. But Temujin's model of leadership was radical. Ability, loyalty, and merit had to be the guiding principles, not birthright. Temujin was already assembling a meritocratic force, drawing warriors based not on noble ancestry, but on their skills and loyalty. The personal rift deepened after 1186, when Jamuka's pride was bruised by Temujin's growing success. Jamuka had always viewed himself as the rightful leader, and Temujin's rise undermined his traditionalist views. The ideological clash was undeniable. Temujin's vision for a unified, merit-based Mongol Empire stood in stark contrast to Jamuka's belief in the inherent superiority of noble blood. Jamuka, unable to reconcile his traditional views with Temujin's new model, broke their bond. He took with him a substantial portion of their forces, aligning himself with the old Mongol nobility. This was no longer a matter of mere rivalry. It was a battle for the soul of the Mongol people. Temujin's break with Jamuka was not just personal. It was the beginning of a new era for the Mongol people, one that would be defined by merit, unity, and strength in leadership over tradition and noble blood. By 1187, the growing animosity between Temujin and Jamuka had culminated in an inevitable clash, a battle not just between two men, but between two competing visions of leadership. Battle of 1187, fought on the vast Mongol steppes, would become a defining moment in the history of the Mongol tribes, one that would shape the future of the region and determine the path that would lead Temujin to the title of Genghis Khan. Jamuka, believing his superior numbers and traditional alliances would overwhelm Temujin's forces, had gathered a formidable army. With over 30,000 warriors, Jamuka's forces vastly outnumbered Temujin's 20,000 men. However, Temujin's army was unlike anything the Mongol steppes had seen before. His warriors were loyal, highly trained, and battle-hardened, men who had earned their place through deeds, not lineage. The battle was fought with ferocity, but it was Temujin's strategic genius that turned the tide. Rather than confronting Jamuka's superior forces head-on, Temujin used the element of surprise, employing feigned retreats and ambush tactics. His forces lured Jamuka's army up into the open steppe, only to turn and strike at their flanks when the enemy had overextended itself. This was a hallmark of Temujin's military brilliance. He understood that victory was not always about sheer strength. It was about strategy, adaptability, and psychological warfare. The outcome was decisive. Temujin's forces crushed Jamuka's army, but the emotional toll was immense. Temujin, though victorious, did not relish the bloodshed. His warriors, too, were filled with reluctance after the battle, knowing that they had fought not just for survival, but for something far greater, a vision for a unified Mongol Empire. In the aftermath, Temujin understood that victory had come at a cost. His once blood brother, now an enemy, had been humiliated, and Temujin could not escape the knowledge that the bitter rivalry between them would never be reconciled. For Jamuka, the battle was a devastating blow. Not only had he suffered a crushing defeat, but his traditional beliefs about noble birth and the right to rule had been shattered. Jamuka's pride, once his greatest strength, had become his greatest weakness. He could no longer deny the fact that Temujin's meritocratic vision had proven itself on the battlefield. Jamuka's defeat symbolized the collapse of the old Mongol order, one built on bloodline and aristocracy, and the rise of a new order, built on loyalty, unity, and merit. The 1206 Kurultai was a moment fraught with both expectation and tension. As the Mongol tribes gathered on the vast plains, the steppes seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the decision that would shape their future. The wind, which usually carried the scent of earth and grass, now felt charged with something more: the weight of history, the collective gaze of tribal leaders, warriors, and chieftains from all corners of the steppes. Temujin stood at the heart of this gathering, a man who had been shaped by hardship, conflict, and betrayal. His rise had not been easy, nor had it been a straight path. Born into a broken world of betrayal, abandonment, and tribal warfare, Temujin had fought not just for his own survival, but for a unified Mongol world. Yet, even as he stood there, on the verge of being crowned as Genghis Khan, a title that would carry the weight of a unified empire, the emotional toll of his journey weighed heavily on his shoulders. The gathering was a mix of loyalty and skepticism. For those who had supported Temujin, the moment was one of eager anticipation. They had seen the rise of a leader who not only had the vision to unite the Mongols, but also the strength to impose that vision on a fractured world. But there were also those present who had doubts, men who had once fought alongside Temujin and now saw his ambition as a threat to the old ways. Temujin was no longer just a warrior. He was becoming the Khan of all Mongols, a universal ruler, and not everyone in the steppes was ready to accept that. As the proclamation was made, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Temujin's voice cut through the tension like a sword. When he declared, "I am Genghis Khan," his words echoed across the steppes. The title, which meant universal ruler, was not just a symbolic one. It was a declaration of his supreme authority over all the Mongol tribes. Genghis Khan, in that moment, was not merely claiming power. He was asserting a new era, one where the old ways of tribal warfare and feudal loyalty would no longer dominate. The reactions were mixed. Among those who had followed Temujin from the very beginning, there was reverence and relief. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. Their loyalty, forged in the heat of battle and strengthened by shared hardship, had finally borne fruit. Temujin, who had been an outcast and a vulnerable leader, now stood as their Khan, recognized by all as the leader of the Mongols. But for others, the proclamation was a moment of uncertainty. The tribal chiefs who had long held power under the old system of bloodline leadership found themselves at a crossroads. Jamuka, once Temujin's closest ally, was not present at the Kurultai, but his absence was felt in the air like a lingering shadow. Jamuka, a champion of the old aristocratic values, had already refused to recognize Temujin's claim. His departure from the Mongol fold, which had begun as a rivalry of ideals, had now become a political schism, one that threatened the fragile unity Temujin had fought so hard to achieve. The Kurultai of 1206 was not just the declaration of a title. It was the moment that Temujin's destiny as the founder of a new Mongol Empire began to unfold. Yet, beneath the formalities of the declaration, the personal cost was clear. Temujin's rise to power had come with betrayals, sacrifices, and emotional tolls that would never leave him. In that moment, even as he was declared Genghis Khan, he knew that the challenges ahead would not be merely military. They would be political, emotional, and most importantly, human. With Temujin's proclamation as Genghis Khan in 1206, the transformation of the Mongol steppes began in earnest. But leadership, especially one as ambitious and far-reaching as Temujin's, required more than just military power and charismatic authority. It required a system, one that could hold together a vast and diverse group of tribes and warriors, each with their own customs, traditions, and grievances. The Yasa, Temujin's legal code, was the cornerstone of this new system. The Yasa was not just a set of laws, it was the framework upon which the Mongol Empire would be built. It was both a legal code and a philosophical manifesto, reflecting Temujin's vision for a unified and cohesive Mongol world. What made the Yasa revolutionary was its emphasis on order, discipline, and loyalty over the traditional system of tribal autonomy. Temujin understood that to create a lasting empire, the Mongols could not continue to rely on the fragmented, tribal laws that had governed their society for centuries. In the past, tribal chiefs enforced laws that were often inconsistent and based on the whims of powerful families. The Yasa sought to put an end to that, establishing a unified legal system that applied to all Mongol tribes. The Yasa touched on every aspect of life, from military conduct to the treatment of foreigners, to the role of women and the rights of the common people. Temujin's creation of the Yasa was not merely a legalistic gesture, it was a social and political revolution. The tribal chiefs, who had long been accustomed to ruling by their own laws, now found themselves subject to a centralized legal code that threatened their old powers. But Temujin was unwavering. He knew that the loyalty of his people depended on fairness and justice, and the Yasa was meant to provide that. The Yasa also enforced the idea of meritocracy, which was central to Temujin's vision. It allowed commoners, merchants, and warriors to rise through the ranks, regardless of their birth. It meant that leadership would be based not on noble blood, but on deeds and loyalty. This was a radical departure from the old Mongol system, where noble birth was the key to power. The Yasa dismantled this hierarchy, offering new opportunities for men of ability and character to rise within the ranks of Temujin's empire. Perhaps most importantly, the Yasa unified the Mongol tribes by providing a common legal framework that could transcend tribal allegiance. It allowed Genghis Khan to create a cohesive empire, where loyalty to the Khan and to the state outweighed tribal loyalty. This legal code was the glue that bound the Mongol tribes together, turning them from a collection of warring factions into a single empire. In the early years of Temujin's rise, the Mongol world was divided, a fractured collection of tribes, each with their own customs, traditions, and leaders. Genghis Khan, as he would later be known, was not born into a position of power. His early life was marked by betrayal, loss, and struggle. As a boy, he witnessed the fracturing of his people when the Tatar tribe poisoned his father, leaving his family to fend for themselves in a harsh, unforgiving world. But it was in these early years of hardship that Temujin would begin to shape his worldview, one that would eventually transform not only the Mongol tribes, but the very nature of warfare. Genghis Khan's understanding of power was grounded in the fact that the Mongol tribes were weak, divided by old feuds and allegiances. He recognized that to bring the Mongols together, he would have to create a military system that was not only strong, but unified. Discipline, speed, and loyalty would become the core principles of his army. But unity was not merely about enforcing loyalty, it was about creating efficiency. The old Mongol system, based on traditional tribal leadership, was chaotic. Leaders ruled based on bloodline or personal charisma, but their armies lacked the structure necessary to fight large-scale campaigns. To address this, Temujin introduced the decimal system, dividing his army into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. This system wasn't just practical. It was a revolutionary approach to organizing the Mongol military. Each unit had a clear command structure, which meant that orders could be passed down efficiently and executed with precision. Each Arban unit of 10 men was led by a Noyan, who was responsible for the well-being, discipline, and coordination of the unit. These Noyans could be promoted based on their ability and loyalty, breaking away from the traditional tribal practices where leadership was often dictated by noble birth. As a result, Genghis Khan's army became a meritocracy where the most capable and loyal men rose through the ranks, regardless of their family background. The strength of this system lay not only in its efficiency, but in its flexibility. It allowed for quick adaptations on the battlefield. If a unit of 1,000 men was lost in battle or needed reinforcements, they could be reorganized into smaller, more flexible units without disrupting the chain of command. The tactical flexibility of the Mongol army meant that it could engage in lightning-fast strikes and then dissolve back into the steppes before the enemy could retaliate. But perhaps the greatest advantage of the decimal system was its ability to foster loyalty and trust among soldiers. The men who fought under Temujin did not see themselves as part of a larger, faceless army. They were part of a tight-knit unit, fighting alongside comrades who had earned their trust. These bonds, forged in the crucible of battle, ensured that the Mongol army would be a force of unwavering discipline and strength. Through his organizational genius, Temujin transformed the Mongol army from a group of nomadic warriors into a highly efficient, unified military machine. The decimal system became the backbone of his empire, allowing him to conquer vast territories and maintain control over an expanding army. It was this system that allowed the Mongols to move swiftly, adapt quickly, and strike with devastating force, making them a force unlike any the world had seen before. While the Mongol military system was revolutionary, it was the Mongol horse archers that would truly cement Genghis Khan's legacy as one of history's greatest military tacticians. The horse archers were not just skilled warriors. They were the pinnacle of Temujin's military vision, a perfect synthesis of speed, precision, and psychological warfare. From a young age, Mongol children were taught the art of riding and archery, skills that would be honed into perfection as they matured. By the time they became warriors, Mongol horse archers were already masters of their craft, capable of firing arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. This was no easy feat. It took years of training to master the composite bow, a powerful weapon made of wood, bone, and sinew, which could shoot arrows at speeds and distances that far exceeded those of most contemporary weapons. But the training was not limited to skill development. It was designed to make the Mongol horse archers adaptable and resilient. Young soldiers were trained to shoot while maneuvering, to attack from multiple angles, and to remain calm under pressure. This training was essential for the success of Temujin's tactics. The Mongol army's mobility and speed were its greatest assets, and the horse archers embodied these qualities. The strategic advantages of Mongol horse archers were unparalleled. Unlike infantry-based armies, the horse archers were extremely mobile, able to strike swiftly and retreat just as quickly. They often engaged in hit-and-run tactics, using their speed to wear down enemies before launching a devastating final strike. One of their most famous tactics was the feigned retreat, where the Mongols would appear to be fleeing from battle, luring their enemies into a disorganized pursuit. At the right moment, the Mongols would turn on their pursuers, unleashing a torrent of arrows that would decimate the enemy before they even had time to regroup. The psychological impact of these tactics cannot be overstated. Enemies faced a terrifying reality when fighting the Mongol horse archers. They could never predict where the attack would come from, or how quickly it would hit. This element of fear was compounded by the invisibility of the Mongol forces, who could strike without warning and vanish back into the vast, featureless plains of the steppes. Temujin's genius was in understanding that fear and uncertainty were just as effective as physical force. The Mongol horse archers' success on the battlefield wasn't just due to their skills. It was due to their discipline and the fact that they were organized into tight-knit units that could act quickly and decisively. Their ability to outmaneuver and outlast their enemies was rooted in the training they underwent and the structure of their army, which allowed them to operate as a seamless fighting force, no matter the size of the battle. Through these horse archers, Genghis Khan's army became not just a force of numbers, but a force of intellect. The training regimen, combined with the strategic application of these units, enabled the Mongols to conquer vast territories and dismantle powerful empires with efficiency and precision. In 1211, the Mongol Empire, under Genghis Khan, turned its gaze toward the Jin Dynasty, the dominant power in northern China. The Jin Dynasty, with its stronghold in Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, represented a formidable enemy. Their cities were heavily fortified, their armies well-disciplined, and their rulers proud of their ancient heritage. But for Genghis Khan, the Jin Dynasty was just another obstacle to overcome in his grand vision for a unified Mongol world. Genghis Khan, shaped by years of struggle and survival, had already demonstrated a masterful understanding of psychological warfare and strategic flexibility. His approach to the Jin Dynasty was a mix of cunning tactics and grueling persistence. Rather than launching a direct assault on the heavily fortified cities, he began with a campaign of raids on the periphery, attacking small settlements and weakening the enemy's supply lines. The Jin Dynasty, accustomed to defending against traditional frontal assaults, were caught off guard by the Mongols' unconventional tactics. But Genghis Khan's greatest innovation was not simply the ability to move quickly. It was the precision with which he executed his strategy. Instead of relying solely on brute force, he understood the importance of psychological manipulation. His forces would retreat after skirmishes, allowing the Jin to believe they were winning. The Jin forces, emboldened by these apparent successes, began to chase the Mongols deeper into their territory, stretched thin by the constant pursuit. When the time came to strike, Genghis Khan's forces did not charge blindly at the gates. Instead, they lured the Jin army into a trap. The Mongols, well versed in feigned retreats, allowed the enemy to push forward, then turned on them with a ferocity that shattered their ranks. The Jin army was unprepared for such an aggressive counterattack, and within days, the Mongol forces had breached the defenses of the Jin cities. The siege of Zhongdu, the capital, was the decisive blow to the Jin dynasty. While the Mongols had launched successful raids on Jin cities before, this victory was different. It wasn't just the capture of a city, it was a demonstration of Genghis Khan's ability to unite his forces and strike with precision at the heart of an empire that had long believed itself unassailable. The fall of Zhongdu symbolized the collapse of the Jin dynasty's resistance and was the beginning of Genghis Khan's dominance in China. For Genghis Khan, the victory over the Jin dynasty was more than just a military triumph. It was a validation of his vision, a vision of a unified Mongol Empire that transcended tribal loyalties and could rival the great empires of the world. The capture of Zhongdu set the stage for further conquests in China and laid the groundwork for the Mongol dominance that would stretch across Asia and Europe. The defeat of the Jin dynasty was not simply about subjugation. It was a symbol of Genghis Khan's rise to power and the unification of the Mongol tribes under one banner. The Western Xia kingdom, ruled by the Tangut people, was the next obstacle in Genghis Khan's path. Located in the northwestern regions of China, the Western Xia kingdom had long resisted Chinese domination. It was a kingdom built on proud traditions, and its people were known for their fierce independence. But Genghis Khan saw the Western Xia not just as a kingdom to conquer, but as a critical piece in his broader plan to dominate China. In 1209, after a failed diplomatic attempt to establish peace, Genghis Khan turned to war. The Tangut rulers were given an ultimatum: submit to Mongol rule or face the full force of Genghis Khan's army. The Tanguts, like many others before them, chose resistance, unaware of the scale of destruction the Mongols were capable of unleashing. Genghis Khan's approach to the Western Xia was calculated and methodical. The Tangut people, like the Jin dynasty, relied heavily on their fortifications and defensive strategies, assuming that their strongholds would deter any invaders. Genghis Khan, however, had already proven his ability to adapt to such defenses. Instead of engaging in traditional siege warfare, he used psychological tactics, guerrilla warfare, and military deception to break the Tangut defenses. The Mongols raided the peripheries of the Western Xia kingdom, disrupting supply lines and forcing the Tangut to spread their forces thin. Genghis Khan's tactics were not about direct confrontation. He attacked where his enemies were weakest. As the Tangut forces stretched themselves thinner and thinner, Genghis Khan's mobile cavalry struck swiftly, wearing down their resistance. The final blow came when the Mongols used their superior mobility to attack from multiple angles. The Western Xia army, overwhelmed by the Mongol strategy, collapsed. Genghis Khan's forces systematically crushed the Tangut defenses, leaving their cities vulnerable. By 1210, the Western Xia were forced to submit to Mongol rule. Their surrender marked the end of the Tangut kingdom's independence and the beginning of Mongol rule over a new stretch of territory. The victory over the Western Xia was significant not only for its military success, but for its strategic importance. It helped Genghis Khan secure his western flank, opening the way for further campaigns into Central Asia and Persia. But it also revealed Genghis Khan's ability to deal with different peoples in diverse ways, negotiation when possible, and devastation when necessary. He understood the psychological nature of warfare, knowing that a decisive victory could secure the loyalty of the conquered peoples or destroy any resistance. In 1218, Genghis Khan was a conqueror, unmatched in his military brilliance. But even a ruler as formidable as he was had limits defined by his honor. The Mongol Empire, under his leadership, had grown rapidly through a combination of military conquests and shrewd diplomatic maneuvers. Yet, when his diplomatic envoy to the Khwarezmian Empire, a Persian kingdom ruled by Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad, was brutally executed in a grievous diplomatic insult, Genghis Khan's response would be swift, furious, and irreversible. The Khwarezmian Empire was located in the region of modern-day Iran and Central Asia, and it was a powerful neighbor to the growing Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan, seeking to expand his influence and establish peace through trade and diplomacy, sent a group of ambassadors to the Shah's court. The Mongols, despite their fearsome reputation, understood the importance of maintaining peaceful relations with neighboring states to avoid unnecessary wars. However, the Shah, who had likely underestimated the might of the Mongol Empire, saw this as an opportunity to assert his own dominance. The execution of one of the ambassadors, and the subsequent murder of the others, was not only a personal affront to Genghis Khan, but also a direct challenge to his authority. In a culture where diplomatic immunity was sacred, this act represented not just an attack on the Mongols, but a humiliation that could not go unanswered. The emotional impact on Genghis Khan was immediate. Honor, the very cornerstone of Mongol society, had been trampled. Genghis Khan knew that to allow such an insult to go unpunished would embolden not just the Khwarezmians, but other neighboring states. It would send a message that the Mongol Khanate was a paper tiger, unable to defend its sovereignty and dignity. This was something he could not allow. In a decision that would change the course of history, Genghis Khan gathered his generals and set his course for war. The Khwarezmian Empire, with its well-established cities, armies, and trade routes, seemed like a formidable foe. Yet Genghis Khan's resolve was unshaken. He knew that this was more than a mere military campaign. It was a war of vengeance, a message to the world that the Mongols would not tolerate disrespect. The invasion that followed was swift, brutal, and decisive. Unlike previous campaigns, this was not a war fought for land alone. It was fought for honor. Genghis Khan's strategy was twofold. First, to completely dismantle the Khwarezmian defense with speed and precision. And second, to instill such fear that no ruler would dare insult the Mongols again. His psychological warfare, as devastating as his military might, would define the Mongol conquests. With the decision made to strike at the Khwarezmian Empire, Genghis Khan's military genius would soon be tested in the twin cities of Bukhara and Samarkand, two of the most powerful and celebrated cities in the Islamic world. Both cities stood as symbols of prosperity, learning, and culture, and both were heavily fortified against any potential invader. To the defenders of these cities, the Mongol horde was little more than a myth, a nomadic force with little chance of overcoming the great walls and trained defenders that protected their cities. What they did not understand was that Genghis Khan was not merely a conqueror, he was a master of terror. As the Mongol forces surrounded Bukhara, they began by deploying a psychological campaign to demoralize the defenders. Mongol scouts infiltrated the city, spreading rumors of the destruction and brutality the Mongols had left in their wake across other conquered lands. Word spread quickly that the Mongols spared no one, no matter their age or status. The city, once proud of its fortified defenses, began to buckle under the weight of fear. When the siege finally began, Genghis Khan's forces did not simply storm the gates. They used a combination of military pressure and psychological manipulation. The Mongols used feigned retreats to lure the defenders into making fatal mistakes, allowing them to whittle down the city's defenses piece by piece. As Bukhara fell, the Mongols flooded the city, and their forces overwhelmed the defenders in a devastating show of precision and speed. But it was not just the military might that won the day. It was fear, the fear that Genghis Khan's reputation inspired. The defenders knew what awaited them: death, destruction, and the complete obliteration of their way of life. The fall of Bukhara was not just a victory for the Mongols, it was a warning to the rest of the Islamic world. From Bukhara, the Mongols turned their attention to Samarkand, another jewel of the Islamic world. The city was larger, richer, and even more heavily fortified than Bukhara, but Genghis Khan's tactics were the same: psychological warfare, deception, and brutal siege tactics. Samarkand, too, fell to the Mongols, and like Bukhara, it was looted, its people massacred, and its buildings burned. The impact on the Islamic world was profound. These two cities, symbols of the Islamic Golden Age, were reduced to rubble. The message was clear: defy the Mongols, and the same fate would await you. The Mongols did not just conquer, they destroyed the very essence of their enemy's identity. By the time the Khwarezmian Empire fell, the world was already beginning to understand the nature of the Mongol conquest. A conquest built not just on military might, but on psychological terror that left an indelible mark on history. The fear Genghis Khan instilled in the hearts of his enemies was more than just a tool for conquest. It was his greatest weapon. The fall of Bukhara and Samarkand ensured that the name of Genghis Khan would be whispered in fear across the Islamic world for generations to come. In 1226, the once indomitable Genghis Khan, whose name had struck terror into the hearts of every nation he encountered, found himself at the edge of a new battlefield, one he could neither conquer nor command. His body, long accustomed to the rigors of war, was beginning to betray him. His bones ached with the weight of years spent on horseback, and the very illnesses that had once been brushed aside now sapped his strength. Despite his advancing age, Genghis Khan's mind remained sharp, as eager for conquest as it had been in his youth. But his body was beginning to deteriorate, and it was a reality he could no longer ignore. His final campaign in 1226 took him to the Western Jia, a rebellious kingdom that had previously submitted to Mongol rule, but had once again begun to resist the growing power of the Mongols. Genghis Khan knew that to maintain the unity of his empire, the Tangut people of the Western Jia must be crushed completely. But unlike the campaigns of his earlier years, this one would be fought with an army of men who were as much a reflection of his leadership as of his deteriorating health. Genghis Khan moved through the camp with the same commanding presence that had earned him the loyalty of his men. His generals, still in awe of his strategic brilliance, looked to him for guidance. But behind his eyes was something that had never been there before: fatigue. He led his army, still, as he had always done, but the weariness in his frame was evident. His steps were slower, his once powerful voice now carrying a note of strain. But still, he was there, at the head of his men. His illness did not stop him. It only seemed to strengthen his resolve to see his final campaign through. As he rode into the mountainous terrain of the Western Jia, his generals noticed how often he needed to pause, how his breath became shallow and labored. Genghis Khan, despite his undeniable physical decline, refused to relinquish his command. His empire was a vast and delicate creation, one he had spent decades building, and it would not collapse on his watch. In the midst of this harsh campaign, his generals saw something in him, a calm certainty that had always been present, but now carried a quiet desperation. He understood that this final battle, this final conquest, was not just about winning. It was about leaving behind a legacy strong enough to endure after he was gone. But he also knew that his legacy would require more than just conquest. It would need to be sustained. Even as the Mongol forces crushed the Western Xia, the emotional toll of leading this campaign became more evident. His commanders would look at him, this towering figure of history, and realize that no matter how fiercely he fought, there were forces even he could not overcome. The natural decay of time, the frailty of human existence. The battle against the Western Xia was brutal and efficient, but for Genghis Khan, it was also a symbol of his own decline. The campaign marked his final victory, but Genghis Khan's strength had faltered. As the Tangut kingdom fell, he knew this would be his last triumph. The unification of his empire, a feat so immense, so unprecedented, would be left in the hands of his sons and generals. His own battle with his body had been fought for too long, and now, even as victory was achieved, the real battle loomed. His final battle with mortality. By 1227, the death of Genghis Khan was no longer a question of if, but when. His body, a vessel once able to endure the most grueling campaigns, had finally given in to the relentless forces of age and illness. As his condition worsened, the once vibrant energy that had defined his every step faded. He had ridden into battle for the last time, leading his armies as he had done for decades. But now, with his empire at its zenith, the great Khan had to face the inevitable. When the end came, it was not in the heat of battle, but in the silence of the Mongol camp. His generals, those who had ridden with him from the beginning, now stood at his side. The empire they had built together was immense, from the Pacific Ocean in the east to the Caspian Sea in the west. The empire was not just a political entity, but a reflection of Genghis Khan's will, his vision for a world united under one banner. Genghis Khan's death marked the end of an era. But what was the legacy he left behind? In his lifetime, he had built the largest contiguous empire in history. The Mongol Empire brought together peoples from all corners of Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. And Genghis Khan's reign reshaped the course of civilization. Yet, his true legacy was not only in the territory he conquered, but in the structure of his empire. His legal code, known as the Yasa, brought order to a land once governed by tribal allegiances. His policies of religious tolerance, meritocracy, and trade unification created a framework that allowed diverse cultures and faiths to coexist under Mongol rule. The Silk Road thrived under the Mongols, and the exchange of ideas, goods, and technologies between the East and West flourished as a result of his conquests. His death, though signaling the end of an era, also marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Mongol Empire. Under his successors, the empire would continue to expand, though not without difficulty. The empire was vast, and maintaining it would prove to be a monumental task. His sons, Ogedei and others, inherited the throne, but none would ever fully replicate Genghis Khan's unity of purpose. His vision, his leadership, and his brutality had made the Mongol Empire what it was. The legacy of Genghis Khan transcended his empire. His name became synonymous with conquest and military brilliance, but also with a new order in the world. His rule united disparate peoples, created a new world order, and changed the course of history. Despite the bloodshed and destruction wrought by his campaigns, the Mongol Empire, in its final form, was not merely a force of conquest, but a catalyst for progress, connecting distant civilizations and sowing the seeds for future global exchange. As Genghis Khan passed into legend, his story became more than that of a conqueror. He was remembered as a man who defied the odds, reshaped the world, and left behind a legacy of unyielding power, vision, and endurance, one that continues to echo through history, reminding the world of the price of greatness and the indelible mark left by a singular, unstoppable force of nature. When Genghis Khan passed away in 1227, his empire, still in its prime, was the largest the world had ever seen. Spanning from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, it was a vast and complex entity that could only be held together by the sheer force of his will, his charisma, and his leadership. But even as the empire stood at the height of its power, the question of what would happen after his death lingered in the minds of his sons, generals, and the many peoples of the empire. Genghis Khan had been the embodiment of Mongol unity, and his death left a leadership vacuum that none could truly fill. Upon his death, the vast Mongol Empire was divided into 4 main khanates, each ruled by one of his sons or grandsons. Ojide, Genghis Khan's third son, was chosen as the Great Khan, taking over the central part of the empire, including the heart of Mongolia. His reign was meant to continue the vision set by his father, though the task of managing such a vast empire would prove to be a monumental challenge, even for a leader of Ogede's ability. To the west, the Ilkhanate, covering the vast territories of Persia and parts of the Middle East, was given to Hulagu Khan, one of Genghis Khan's grandsons. Hulagu, a brilliant general in his own right, was entrusted with ensuring the Mongol dominance over the western part of the empire, but the distance between his territory and the center of Mongol power in Mongolia made communication and control difficult. The Ilkhanate, though successful in maintaining power in the region, would ultimately struggle with the lack of a unified vision. The Golden Horde was established in the northwest by Batu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, who became the ruler of the Russian steppes and much of Eastern Europe. Batu's leadership helped solidify Mongol control over these territories, but as the years went on, the ties to the central Mongol authority weakened, and regional leaders began to assert more independence. Finally, the Yuan dynasty was founded in China by Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, whose reign saw the Mongols fully conquer the Song dynasty and establish the first foreign-ruled Chinese empire. Kublai's leadership marked a new era, one in which the Mongols adapted to Chinese governance and sought to consolidate Mongol rule within China itself, a process that ultimately saw the Yuan dynasty become culturally distinct from the other Mongol khanates. However, as Genghis Khan's sons and grandsons assumed control of these vast territories, the unity of the Mongol Empire, forged through blood and conquest, began to fracture. The khanates, though all part of the same empire, often found themselves at odds with one another. Conflicting ambitions, misunderstandings, and growing local power led to internal tensions. Ogedei, though a capable leader, was often distracted by personal indulgence and internal struggles, undermining the strength of his rule. Hulagu and Batu faced their own challenges, both military and political, and Kublai Khan, while successful in China, became increasingly focused on his own agenda, diminishing the cohesion that Genghis Khan had worked so tirelessly to establish. Moreover, the great vision of Genghis Khan was slowly diluted as his descendants took their respective thrones. The deep sense of loyalty to the central Great Khan began to erode, and many regional leaders found themselves reluctant to follow the commands of rulers who were far removed from the center of Mongol power. Despite this, the Mongol khanates remained powerful for many years, and they maintained their military might, even as their political unity weakened. As the centuries passed, the divisions within the empire became more pronounced. Eventually, the Ilkhanate disintegrated into a series of smaller states. The Golden Horde began to fragment under its weakened leadership, and the Yuan dynasty in China fell to the Ming dynasty. While the Mongol khanates may have been divided after Genghis Khan's death, the legacy of his empire, his ability to unify such vast and diverse regions, would continue to shape world history for centuries to come. Though Genghis Khan's empire began to fragment soon after his death, the long-term effects of the Mongol Empire on the world were profound and enduring. The Mongols were not just conquerors, they were agents of change, connecting far-flung civilizations in ways that had never been seen before. Their vast empire created a unified space for trade, culture, and ideas to flow freely across Eurasia, leaving a legacy that influenced the development of global trade networks, cultural exchange, and political structures for centuries. One of the most significant aspects of Mongol rule was the establishment of the Pax Mongolica, or the Mongol Peace. Under the Mongols, a vast network of trade routes, known as the Silk Road, was reopened and secured. The Mongols, unlike other conquerors, recognized the value of commerce and sought to facilitate trade across their empire, ensuring the safety of merchants and travelers. This led to a boom in trade between the East and West, as goods, ideas, and technologies flowed freely between the Chinese heartlands, Persia, and Europe. The Mongol Empire served as a connector, linking civilizations that had been isolated for centuries. The Pax Mongolica was not just about economic exchange. It also allowed for cultural and intellectual exchange on an unprecedented scale. Art, science, and philosophy from China, Persia, the Islamic world, and Europe began to blend and influence one another in ways that had never occurred before. For example, the Mongols' interactions with the Islamic world led to the introduction of Persian astronomy and medicine into the broader Eurasian landscape, while Chinese inventions, such as gunpowder and printing technology, spread westward. The exchange of these technologies and ideas helped to lay the foundation for the Renaissance in Europe. Politically, the Mongol Empire had a lasting impact on the governance structures of the lands it controlled. Genghis Khan's legal code, the Yasa, became a model for later rulers, promoting a meritocratic system and religious tolerance. The Mongols did not seek to impose a single system of governance or culture on the vast regions they conquered. Instead, they allowed for a degree of autonomy while ensuring that their subjects adhered to Mongol law. This flexibility allowed different cultures to thrive under Mongol rule, from the Persians in the Ilkhanate to the Chinese in the Yuan dynasty. But the effects of the Mongol Empire were not just economic and cultural. The Mongols also left an indelible mark on the political landscape of the time. The Mongol invasions had devastating effects on many regions, particularly in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. The siege of Baghdad in 1258, for example, marked the end of the Abbasid Caliphate, and the destruction of the city of Bukhara remains one of the most iconic moments in Mongol history. However, even in these areas, the Mongols' indirect influence was felt for centuries. In Eastern Europe, the Mongols' dominance over the region and the subsequent rise of the Grand Duchy of Moscow would play a critical role in shaping the political future of Russia. In China, Kublai Khan's establishment of the Yuan dynasty paved the way for the Ming dynasty, and the Mongol influence on the region's governance structures, infrastructure, and cultural institutions would resonate for generations. The Mongols also played a central role in the dissemination of knowledge between China and the West, fostering greater understanding between the two civilizations. The long-term effects of Mongol rule were felt not just in the immediate aftermath of their empire, but in the subsequent centuries. The legacy of the Pax Mongolica endured as a foundational moment in the development of global trade, cross-cultural exchange, and the political structures of the modern world. The decline of the Mongol Empire, the vast and mighty force forged by the indomitable will of Genghis Khan, was as dramatic as its rise. At the time of his death in 1227, the Mongol Empire was a force without equal, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, covering vast swathes of Central Asia, China, and the Middle East. Yet, within a century, the unity that Genghis Khan had so carefully constructed began to crumble, and the once unified empire splintered into disparate, often rivaling khanates. The reasons for this fragmentation are manifold, arising both from internal factors, tied to leadership, succession, and governance, and from external pressures, ranging from rebellion and conquest to changing geopolitical realities. Internal factors. 1. Succession struggles. The most immediate and significant cause of the Mongol Empire's decline after Genghis Khan's death was the issue of succession. While Genghis Khan had named his son, Ogedei, as his great Khan, the succession was never fully secure. Genghis Khan's empire was so vast, and its leadership so deeply tied to the strength of his personal charisma, that when he passed, there was no universally agreed upon system for choosing his heirs. This vacuum of power led to internal rivalry among his sons, grandsons, and generals, all vying for greater influence over their inherited territories. Ogedei, despite being a capable ruler, could not maintain the unity of the empire as Genghis Khan had. His death in 1241 led to a series of succession crises, with various factions within the empire seeking to elevate their own candidates to the throne. The absence of a clear, unifying vision following Genghis Khan's death meant that the empire could no longer function as a cohesive whole, and the cracks in its foundation began to widen. 2. Divisions between the khanates. Even as the Mongol khanates expanded, the territorial divisions created after Genghis Khan's death played a role in its eventual fragmentation. The empire was split into 4 major khanates, each ruled by one of Genghis Khan's descendants: the Jin Dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. Though initially these khanates paid homage to the Great Khan, over time, the geographical distances and differing regional interests created independence from the central Mongol authority. This lack of centralized control led to a weakening of the Mongol state's unity. The Golden Horde in the northwest began to assert its own dominance in the Kievan Rus and Eastern Europe, while the Ilkhanate in Persia grew increasingly isolated from the other khanates, focusing more on the Islamic world. Kublai Khan, the founder of the Yuan dynasty, pursued a distinctively Chinese-oriented path, separating the Mongol rulers from their Central Asian roots. As a result, rather than continuing Genghis Khan's dream of a unified empire, the khanates became more distinct from each other, leading to competing factions and internal strife. 3. Cultural and administrative differences. As the Mongols expanded, they encountered and incorporated diverse cultures, religions, and political systems. Genghis Khan had been a unifying force, a charismatic leader who imposed Mongol law, but also tolerated the customs and religions of the regions he conquered. His successors, however, did not always share the same degree of cultural unity or administrative vision. For instance, Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty adopted many Chinese governance practices and promoted the use of Chinese bureaucrats, which distanced them from the Mongol military traditions and customs. Similarly, the Ilkhanate in Persia adapted many Persian administrative practices. This cultural divergence, while successful in some regions, led to weakening loyalty to the core Mongol identity and lessened the cohesion needed to maintain a united empire. External factors. 1. Rebellions and rebellious leaders. As the Mongols moved westward and expanded their empire, they encountered resistance from local populations and rival powers. The Mamluks in Egypt, the Delhi Sultanate in India, and the Japanese in the Yuan dynasty's eastern territories all resisted Mongol invasions. These forces, while often defeated in battle, were persistent and helped weaken the Mongol Empire's control over certain regions. Rebellions within the khanates themselves, fueled by local tribal rivalries and discontent, further destabilized the empire. In the Ilkhanate, for example, the empire faced rebellions from local governors who began to defy Mongol rule, seeking greater autonomy. 2. The Black Death. One of the most devastating external factors that contributed to the decline of the Mongol Empire was the outbreak of the Black Death in the mid-14th century. The bubonic plague spread rapidly across the Silk Road, devastating populations in both Europe and Asia. The Mongols, who had brought stability to trade routes and had fostered the exchange of goods and ideas between East and West, now found themselves facing the plague's wrath. Whole cities were wiped out, and the economy of the empire collapsed under the weight of this crisis. The collapse of trade due to the plague, combined with the death of millions, drained the empire's resources and undermined its military strength. As the population shrank, the Mongol khanates found it increasingly difficult to maintain their borders and suppress uprisings. The plague accelerated the already existing fragmentation of Mongol rule as regional leaders began to carve out their own domains. 3. The rise of new powers. As the Mongol Empire weakened, new powers arose to challenge the Mongol legacy. In China, the Ming dynasty overthrew the Yuan dynasty, rejecting Mongol rule and reasserting native Chinese governance. In Russia, the Grand Duchy of Moscow began to rise, asserting its dominance after the decline of the Golden Horde. In Persia, the Safavids would eventually emerge as a powerful force, marking the end of Mongol influence in the region. These rising powers, many of which owed their rise to the weakening of Mongol control, helped dismantle the once mighty empire Genghis Khan had built. Despite the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire, the vision of Genghis Khan did not vanish entirely. His commitment to unity, through conquest, law, and a belief in the power of meritocratic leadership, was carried forward by many of his successors, though often in modified forms. The Yuan dynasty in China, for example, continued the Mongol legacy of centralized rule while integrating Chinese bureaucracy into its administration. Similarly, the Ilkhanate in Persia maintained Mongol traditions of religious tolerance and legal codes, even as it adapted to local conditions. Even in the decay of the Mongol Empire, the vision Genghis Khan had set in motion, an empire where diverse cultures could coexist and trade routes could flourish, laid the groundwork for later empires and global exchanges. His methods of governance, his military innovations, and his ability to unite such disparate peoples left a blueprint for future rulers, including those of the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Tsardom, and even the Mughal Empire in India. While the Mongol khanates ultimately fractured, the legacy of Genghis Khan endured in the global systems of trade he helped establish. His conquests had opened up Eurasian markets, laid the foundation for modern diplomacy, and reshaped the political landscape of much of the world. Though his empire could not withstand the internal strife, plague, and the rise of new powers, Genghis Khan's original vision of a world united by trade, law, and military strength would continue to influence the trajectory of global civilization for centuries to come. Thank you for watching this story until the end. If you found this one captivating, you're in for a treat with the next one. It's just as fascinating, if not more, than you could ever imagine. Don't miss out. Click on the image on your screen now to dive into the next adventure.